They said we were done. A crippled man with a shattered leg, and a 12-year-old bulldog who couldn't even climb the stairs without gasping for air. The whole town looked at us and saw nothing but leftovers, just trash waiting for the garbage truck. And maybe they were right. Maybe we were useless. But on the night the storm drain swallowed an 8-year-old boy, when the police hesitated, and the strongest men stood back, the only thing standing between a child and death was the one creature nobody believed in. This isn't a story about a hero. Heroes are strong. Heroes are fast. This is a story about an anchor. And sometimes, the only thing that holds in a storm is the heavy, broken thing you almost threw away. It started on a Tuesday. The kind of gray, miserable Tuesday that makes your bones ache. The rain had been falling over Blackwood for 3 days straight. A relentless gray curtain that turned the world outside into a blurred watercolor of rust and concrete. Inside the small, siding-clad house on the edge of town, the air smelled of damp drywall and stale beer. Mark sat in his recliner, the leather cracked and peeling beneath his elbows. His left leg, the one with the titanium rod drilled through the tibia, throbbed in time with the steady drumming on the tin roof. He didn't rub it. He didn't shift his weight to ease the pressure. He just let it hurt. Pain was the only thing that felt honest anymore. At his feet, Lou was fighting a losing battle with gravity. The English bulldog was a wreck of a creature, a heap of wrinkled skin and white fur stained brown around the muzzle. Lou was 12 years old, which in bulldog years made him ancient. A relic from a time before Mark's life had derailed. The dog planted his front paws on the edge of the sofa, his back legs scrambling against the hardwood floor. His claws made a frantic, scratching sound against the varnish, slipping, finding purchase, then slipping again. Mark took a slow sip of his beer, his eyes flat and unblinking. He watched the struggle with the detached interest of a man watching a rerun of a show he hated. Lou let out a low, frustrated whine. The dog's heavy chest heaved, his breathing sounding like a saw cutting through wet wood. He pushed one more time, his back muscles trembling with the effort, trying to haul his 70-pound bulk up to the cushion where he had slept every day for a decade. But his hips, stiff with arthritis, betrayed him. His back legs gave way, and he slid backward, hitting the floor with a heavy, dull sound that vibrated through the floorboards. Lou didn't get up immediately. He just lay there on the cold wood, his flat face pressed against the floor, his large, sorrowful eyes rolling up to look at Mark. Mark didn't move. He didn't reach down to help. He didn't offer a word of encouragement. "Give it up, Lou," Mark said, his voice rough from disuse. It wasn't cruel, just empty. Gravity always wins eventually. You ought to know that by now. The dog let out a heavy sigh, a long expulsion of air that flapped his loose jowls, and resigned himself to the floor. He rested his chin on his paws, his gaze drifting away from Mark to stare at the dust motes dancing in the dim light of the television. Mark crushed the empty beer can in his hand. The metal crumpled with a sharp crinkle that sounded too loud in the quiet house. He looked at the dog, really looked at him, and saw a mirror image of himself. Lou was useless now. He couldn't run, couldn't guard the house, could barely breathe without sounding like a broken engine. He was just taking up space, consuming resources, waiting for the inevitable shutdown. Just like the man in the chair. On the side table, Mark's phone began to buzz. It vibrated against the wood, a persistent, angry insect demanding attention. The screen lit up, illuminating a name that used to mean home. Ellen. Mark stared at the name. He could picture her clearly, the worry lines etched into her forehead, the way she would tell him that he needed to get out, that he needed to see someone, that the accident wasn't his fault. She would try to fix him. But you can't fix a car that's been totaled. You just strip it for parts and crush the rest. He watched the phone until the screen went dark. The buzzing stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. Mark leaned forward, the joints in his knee popping audibly, and set the crushed can on the table beside the silent phone. He looked down at Lou. The dog had closed his eyes, his breathing settling into a rhythmic, wheezing snore. "We're just leftovers, buddy," Mark whispered into the gloom. Just the scrap metal nobody bothered to haul away to the junkyard. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose window frames. The storm was getting worse. The weatherman had called it a historic system, a deluge that would test the levees and the drainage systems of the entire county. But in this living room, the atmosphere was already drowning. Mark reached for another can, cracked the tab, and took a long swallow, drowning out the guilt of the unassisted dog and the unanswered phone. He closed his eyes and listened to the rain, unaware that the water rising outside was about to wash away the numbness he had worked so hard to build. By the time Mark wrestled his stiff leg into his rain pants and shoved his feet into his boots, the weather had graduated from a steady drumbeat to a violent assault. The wind howled around the corners of the porch, stripping the last dead leaves from the oak trees and plastering them against the siding like wet papier-mâché. Lou stood by the door, his head lowered, looking at the threshold with deep suspicion. He hated the rain. In his younger years, a drop of water on his nose was enough to make him turn tail and hide under the bed. But nature called with an urgency that outweighed comfort, and Mark clipped the heavy leather leash onto the dog's collar with a metallic snap. "Let's make this quick," Mark grumbled, pushing the door open. "Do your business, and let's get back to rotting in peace." They stepped out into the deluge. The cold hit Mark like a physical blow, seeping instantly through his jacket. The street was deserted, the gutters overflowing with a brown, churning sludge that looked more like chocolate milk than water. The entire neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath, hunkered down behind drawn blinds and locked doors. Lou didn't run. He didn't trot. He waddled with agonizing slowness, his paws squelching in the sodden lawn. Mark huddled inside his hood, rainwater dripping off the brim and running down his neck. His bad leg seized up in the damp cold, a spike of agony shooting up his shin with every step, a hot, sharp reminder of metal pins and shattered bone. "Come on, Lou," Mark urged, giving the leash a gentle tug. "I'm freezing out here." But Lou wasn't listening. The old dog had stopped dead on the sidewalk, right next to the storm drain at the corner of Elm and 4th. The grate was half clogged with debris, twigs, trash, and mats of decaying leaves, causing the rushing water to swirl violently before being sucked down into the darkness below. Mark pulled the leash harder. "This isn't the spot, buddy. The grass is over there." Lou didn't budge. He planted his forepaws wide, locking his elbows in that immovable, concrete block stance that only a bulldog possesses. His head was down, his flat nose pressed dangerously close to the rusted iron bars of the grate. The water rushed over his paws, soaking his chest, but he ignored it. "For God's sake, Lou." Mark's patience, thin as paper to begin with, tore down the middle. He stepped closer, intending to scoop the 70-pound animal up and carry him if he had to. "I am not standing out here while you sniff garbage water. Move." He reached down, grabbing the dog's harness. That was when he felt it. Lou wasn't just standing there. He was trembling. Not the shivering of a cold dog, but the high-frequency vibration of a focused predator. Lou let out a sound Mark had never heard from him before. Not a bark, but a high, thin whine that seemed to originate from the back of his throat, a sound of pure distress. Mark paused, his hand still on the harness. The hair on the back of his neck prickled, an old instinct flaring to life beneath the layers of cynicism and beer. He looked at the dog, then followed the dog's gaze down into the black maw of the sewer. "What is it?" Mark whispered, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a sudden, cold unease. Lou whined again, louder this time, and pawed frantically at the iron grate. His claws scraped against the metal, a desperate, scratching plea. Mark knelt on the wet pavement, ignoring the pain in his knee. He leaned close to the drain, the smell of rot and sewage filling his nose. The roar of the water was loud, a chaotic churning that drowned out the world above. He was about to pull back, convinced Lou was just chasing the scent of a rat, when he heard it. It was faint, barely a thread of sound woven into the tapestry of the storm. It wasn't the hiss of a cat or the squeak of a rodent. It was a rhythmic, wet congestion, the sound of air struggling to pass through a nose thick with mucus and tears. A sniffle. Mark froze. He turned his head, pressing his ear almost to the rushing water. "Hello?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Is someone down there?" No answer. Just the rushing water and the wind. Mark shook his head, telling himself he was losing his mind, that the isolation was finally making him hear ghosts. He started to stand up, ready to drag Lou home, when a flash of color caught his eye. Wedged into the corner of the grate, held fast by the pressure of the flowing water and a tangle of sticks, was a shoe. It wasn't just any shoe. It was a small, Velcro-strapped sneaker, bright red with a cartoon lightning bolt on the side. Mark stared at it, the rain hammering against his back, his breath catching in his throat. He knew that shoe. He had seen it just yesterday, flashing past his window as the neighbor's kid ran loops around his front yard. It belonged to the boy from 2 doors down. The quiet one. The one who never looked anyone in the eye and flapped his hands when he was excited. Sam. The realization hit Mark with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. The sneaker was empty. Mark scrambled back down to the grate, his face inches from the black water. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his apathy. "Sam," he roared into the darkness, his voice raw. "Sam, can you hear me?" From the depths of the earth, beneath the concrete and the asphalt, a small, terrified voice drifted up, weak and trembling, carried on the back of the stench and the dark. "Mommy?" "Sam," Mark yelled, his mouth pressing against the cold, rusted iron of the grate. "Sam, listen to me. Don't move. I'm right here." The voice that drifted back up was small, distant and terrifyingly calm amidst the roar of the rising water. "The water is loud," Sam said. "The kitty doesn't like it. It's too wet." Mark's stomach turned to ice. The drainage system in this part of town was old, a labyrinth of brick and concrete designed decades ago. In a storm like this, those tunnels weren't just uncomfortable. They were pressurized death traps. The water level would be rising by the inch every minute, filling the pipes until there was no air left to breathe. "Sam, listen to me closely," Mark shouted, wiping rain from his eyes. "I need you to stay where you are. Can you see light? Look up." "It's dark," the boy replied, his voice trembling now. "I want to go home." Mark grabbed the bars of the heavy iron grate. It was a solid slab of cast iron, cemented into the curb by years of rust and road tar. He wrapped his fingers around the cold metal, planted his good foot on the slippery asphalt, and pulled. He pulled with everything he had remaining in his rusted-out body. The veins in his neck bulged, his teeth ground together until his jaw ached. The grate didn't budge. It didn't even groan. It held fast, mocking his effort. Desperation made him reckless. Mark shifted his stance, putting his weight onto his left leg, the shattered one, to get better leverage. He drove his heel down and heaved upward with a guttural roar. For a second, the grate seemed to shift. Then, his leg exploded. It wasn't a sound, but a sensation so violent it blinded him. It felt as though the titanium rod inside his bone had turned white-hot and was trying to melt its way out through his skin. The agony sheared through his nervous system, bypassing thought, bypassing reason, and striking directly at the primitive center of his brain. Mark collapsed. He hit the wet pavement hard, rolling onto his back, clutching his shin as a scream tore from his throat, lost instantly in the howling wind. But as he lay there, gasping for air, the street faded. The rain on his face wasn't falling from the sky anymore. It was spraying up from a churning river. The gray asphalt beneath him dissolved into the slick, unstable surface of a rescue raft. He was back there, 5 years ago. The Hocking River, swollen with spring melt. The phantom pain in his leg became real again. He could feel the rope burning his palms. He could hear the roar of the rapids, a sound like a freight train derailment that never ended. And he could hear Miller, his partner, screaming over the comms. "Hold the line, Mark! Don't let it slip!" He saw the overturned kayak. He saw the hand reaching out from the white foam. He felt the tension on the rope, the impossible weight of a human life dragging against his grip. And then he felt the snap. The boat lurching, his leg getting caught in the rigging, the bone shattering, and his hand opening. He had let go. Mark curled into a ball on the sidewalk, hyperventilating. The world was spinning. He wasn't a man in a suburban neighborhood anymore. He was a failure drowning in his own guilt, his chest constricted, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "I can't do this," the voice in his head screamed. "I'm broken. I'm useless. If I try, I'll just kill him too. I have to call someone. I have to get help. I have to leave." He started to scramble backward, clawing at the wet grass, trying to put distance between himself and the drain. He reached for his pocket, fumbling for his phone with shaking hands, intending to dial 911 and then run. Run back to his house, back to his chair, back to the bottle where he didn't have to be responsible for a life. He was retreating, fleeing. Then something clamped onto his ankle. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was a hard, jarring yank that nearly dislocated his knee. Mark gasped, the flashback shattering like glass. He looked down. Lou had his jaws clamped firmly around the cuff of Mark's jeans. The old bulldog was digging his back claws into the mud, his entire body lowered and braced, pulling Mark back toward the drain with a strength that belied his age. "Lou, let go!" Mark choked out, trying to kick his leg free. Lou didn't let go. He growled, a low, rumbling vibration that traveled up Mark's leg and settled in his bones. It wasn't an aggressive growl, it was a command. The dog yanked again, harder, shaking his head side to side, dragging Mark inches closer to the grate. Mark looked into the dog's eyes. Usually, Lou's eyes were droopy, sad, and filled with a perpetual sleepiness. But not now. Now they were wide, dark and burning with a ferocious, undeniable clarity. There was no fear in them, no hesitation, only a singular driving purpose. "Get up," those eyes said. "We are not done." The dog released the pant leg and barked, a sharp, explosive sound right in Mark's face. He stepped closer, nudging Mark's shoulder with his wet, blocky head, pushing him back toward the hole. Mark stared at the animal. This creature, who couldn't climb a sofa without help, was refusing to let his master surrender. The shame hit Mark harder than the pain in his leg had. He wiped the rain and tears from his face with a trembling hand. The sound of the river in his head faded, replaced by the terrifying reality of Sam's silence below. "Okay," Mark whispered, his voice cracking. He reached out and grabbed Lou's thick neck, using the dog as a crutch to pull himself into a kneeling position. "Okay, Lou, I hear you." He crawled back to the grate. He couldn't lift it. He knew that now. He was too broken to be the hero who ripped the door off the hinges. But he looked closer at the concrete surrounding the metal frame. The earth had eroded slightly on the far side, where the curb had crumbled away years ago. There was a gap, a small, jagged opening between the bottom of the grate and the drainage pipe itself. It was too small for a man. Too small for a rescue swimmer. But it wasn't too small for something else. Mark looked at the gap. Then he looked at Lou. The dog was already sniffing the opening, whining, his body tense, his stubby tail twitching. Lou looked back at Mark, and in that exchange, an unspoken understanding passed between them. Mark swallowed the lump in his throat. "You crazy bastard," he whispered, fear and pride warring in his chest. "You really want to go in there?" Lou didn't wait for permission. He jammed his broad head into the gap and began to push. The anatomy of an English bulldog is a defiance of nature. They are built like cinder blocks wrapped in loose velvet, broad shoulders, barrel chests, and hips that don't quite align with the rest of the machinery. They are not designed for agility, and they are certainly not designed for spelunking into the subterranean drain pipes of a flooding city. Mark knew this. As he watched Lou jam his head and shoulders into the jagged gap beneath the grate, his heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The dog was scraping his belly against the rough concrete, his back legs scrambling uselessly on the slick asphalt as he tried to drive his considerable bulk forward. "You stubborn old fool," Mark whispered, his voice thick with a terrifying mixture of pride and dread. He moved behind the dog, placing his hands on Lou's hips. He could feel the animal's muscles bunching under the thick fur, vibrating with strain. Mark ignored the screaming agony in his own leg and leaned his weight forward, shoving the dog into the hole. Lou let out a grunt of exertion, twisted his body in a way that shouldn't have been possible, and popped through the opening like a cork being pushed into a bottle. One moment, his white curly tail was visible. The next, he was gone, swallowed by the earth. Mark pressed his face to the gap. "Lou? Find him, Lou. Find the boy." Down in the dark, the world was a sensory nightmare. 8-year-old Sam was pressing his back against the curved, slimy wall of the drainage pipe. The water wasn't just cold. It was a living, biting thing that had already crept past his waist, soaking his jeans and numbing his legs. It smelled of old leaves and copper. Sam didn't process fear like other children. He didn't scream. When the world became too loud or too scary, Sam went inward. He shut down the external inputs and focused on one single anchor. Right now, that anchor was the shivering, wet ball of fur in his arms. "It's okay, Mittens," Sam whispered into the cat's ear, rocking back and forth in a rhythm that matched the pulsing of his own blood. "The water is just a blanket, a cold blanket. We have to wait for the dry cycle." But the water was rising. It lapped at his elbows now. The roar of the storm outside echoed down the pipe, magnified into a monstrous, booming thunder that made his teeth ache. It was too dark. Sam squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the darkness, trying to imagine he was in his bed with his weighted blanket. Then there was a new sound. It wasn't the water. It wasn't the thunder. It was a heavy, rhythmic rasplessness. A wet, laboring sound like a saw cutting through damp wood. Good Gook. Sam opened his eyes. Coming toward him through the black tunnel was a shape. In the dim, gray light filtering down from the grate far above, it looked like a monster. It was low to the ground, wide as a boulder, splashing through the current with a clumsy, determined gait. It had no neck, just a massive head that seemed to plow through the water like a barge. Sam froze. He clutched the cat tighter, his knuckles turning white. The monster was wheezing. It was snorting. It was coming straight for him. The creature reached him and stopped. It stood in the waist-deep water, its heavy chest heaving, fighting for every breath in the humid, suffocating air of the pipe. Sam pressed himself harder against the concrete, waiting for the bite. He had read about monsters in his books. They always had teeth. But the monster didn't bite. Instead, it leaned forward. A massive, wet, blocky head pressed against Sam's chest. It was heavy and solid, a warm weight in a freezing world. Then, a tongue, rough as sandpaper and shockingly warm, slid up the side of Sam's face, wiping away a streak of cold mud and tears. The creature let out a long, shuddering sigh and leaned its entire body weight against Sam's legs, pinning the boy against the wall. It wasn't attacking, it was bracing him. The water current pushed against them, trying to sweep Sam's small feet out from under him. But the dog was an immovable object. He was a living sandbag, a furry anchor dropped into the rushing tide to hold the boy in place. Sam blinked, the terror in his chest loosening just a fraction. He slowly uncurled one hand from the cat and reached out. His small fingers sank into the thick, loose rolls of skin on the dog's neck. The fur was coarse and soaked, but beneath it, Sam could feel a steady, thumping heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. It was slower than his own, calmer. "You're not a monster," Sam whispered, his voice trembling as he buried his face in the dog's wet neck. "You're a tank." Lou grunted in agreement, shifting his stance to get a better grip on the slippery floor of the pipe. He looked up toward the unreachable grate above and let out a single, sharp bark, a sound that echoed off the curved walls like a gunshot, signaling to the world above that the package had been secured. Above ground, Mark slumped against the wet asphalt, the sound of that bark hitting him like a shot of adrenaline. He scrambled closer to the hole, his voice raw with relief. "Good boy, Lou. Good boy. Stay with him." He had a connection now, a lifeline. But as he looked at the water swirling around his own boots, rising higher with every passing second, Mark knew the hard part hadn't even started. Lou had found the boy, but they were still trapped in a stone tomb that was rapidly filling with water. And Mark, with his shattered leg and empty hands, was powerless to get them out alone. He needed help. And as if summoned by the devil himself, a pair of headlights swept across the rain-slicked street, blinding him. A police cruiser rolled to a stop at the curb, the red and blue lights flashing silently in the storm, casting long, dancing shadows over the scene of the impending disaster. The police cruiser did not bring salvation. It brought a wall of blinding white light. Two high-intensity beams cut through the deluge, pinning Mark against the wet pavement like a specimen under a microscope. He shielded his eyes, blinking against the glare, his heart leaping with a desperate, foolish hope. "Over here," Mark screamed, waving his arms frantically. "Bring a crowbar. Hurry!" The driver's side door swung open against the wind. A boot hit the asphalt, followed by the towering figure of Deputy Miller. Miller was young, barely 25. With a jawline that suggested he spent too much time in the gym and eyes that suggested he hadn't seen enough of the world to know when to break the rules. He wore his raincoat like armor, stiff and pristine. Miller didn't run toward the drain. He walked with a measured, deliberate pace, his hand resting instinctively on his belt. To him, the scene was textbook. A derelict man, soaked to the bone, possibly intoxicated, tampering with city infrastructure in the middle of a state of emergency. "Step away from the grate, sir," Miller commanded. His voice wasn't shouting, but it carried the practiced projection of law enforcement. "Back up onto the sidewalk, now." Mark didn't move back. He lunged forward, pointing a shaking finger at the iron bars. "You don't understand. There is a child down there. Sam. The neighbor's kid is trapped in the pipe." Miller stopped 5 feet away. He looked at Mark's wild eyes, his matted hair plastered to his skull, and the way he was favoring his left leg, swaying unsteadily. The deputy made a quick, silent calculation. Drunk or high, definitely unstable. "I said step back," Miller repeated, his tone hardening. He unclipped the flashlight from his belt and shined it directly into Mark's face, blinding him again. "We have reports of flooding all over the county. I don't have time for hallucinations, Mark. I know who you are. Go home and sleep it off before you hurt yourself." Mark felt a surge of rage so hot, it almost cauterized the pain in his leg. He swatted at the light. "I am not drunk. Listen to me. My dog is down there with him. The water is rising." "You put your dog in the sewer?" Miller's face twisted in disgust. He stepped closer, reaching for Mark's arm. "Okay, that's it. You're coming with me. We're done here." "No." Mark shoved the deputy's hand away. It was a mistake. Miller reacted instantly. He twisted Mark's arm behind his back and slammed him forward against the hood of the cruiser. Pain exploded in Mark's shattered knee, sending white spots dancing across his vision. He gasped, his cheek pressed against the cold, wet metal of the car. "Assaulting an officer," Miller recited, pulling a set of handcuffs from his belt. The metal rattled ominously. "You're under arrest." You idiot," Mark choked out, spitting rainwater. "You're killing him. Just look in the damn hole." "Stop fighting." Miller pressed his weight down on Mark's back. "You're making this worse for yourself." Time was bleeding away. Every second they wasted wrestling on the hood of the car was another gallon of water filling the pipe below. Mark could feel the vibration of the storm in the car's chassis, a low hum of impending disaster. He was helpless. The system, the rules, the authority. It was all designed to maintain order. But right now, order was a death sentence. Miller keyed the radio on his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4. I have a 10:55 in progress at Elm and 4th. Suspect is combative. Requesting." He never finished the sentence. From the storm drain a few yards away, a sound erupted. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the rain, it was a bark. But it wasn't a normal bark. It was deep, resonant, and echoed with a hollow, metallic quality, amplified by the acoustics of the tunnel. It sounded like a cannon shot fired from the center of the earth. Miller froze. His finger hovered over the radio button. Then came the second sound. Fainter, higher pitched. A voice. "Mommy, help." The color drained from Deputy Miller's face. He looked at Mark, then at the dark, swirling mouth of the drain. The certainty in his eyes shattered, replaced by a dawn of horror. He released Mark's arm and took a slow, stumbling step toward the curb. Mark slid off the hood of the car, nearly collapsing as his bad leg buckled. He didn't run. He limped, dragging himself toward the deputy. "Do you hear that?" Mark hissed, grabbing Miller by the front of his raincoat. "That is an 8-year-old boy, and he is running out of air. Now, are you going to arrest me, or are you going to help me lift this grate?" Miller stared at the iron bars. He looked at his pristine uniform, then at the muddy, desperate man in front of him. He holstered his flashlight. He didn't say a word. He just walked to the edge of the drain, jammed his fingers through the rusted iron slats, and braced his boots against the asphalt. "On 3, Miller said, his voice trembling slightly. 1, 2, 3. The iron grate weighed 300 pounds, cemented by decades of rust and neglect. But adrenaline is a powerful solvent. Mark and Miller heaved together, a synchronized grunt of exertion tearing from their throats. The metal screamed, a high, piercing shriek of iron grinding against stone, and then gave way. They flipped it backward, and it landed on the pavement with a skull-rattling clang. The hole was open. Mark didn't hesitate. He grabbed the coil of rescue rope from the back of Miller's cruiser, standard issue, yellow, thick as a thumb. "I'm lowering the line?" he yelled over the roar of the water. He peered into the abyss. The flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a nightmare. The water was black, churning violently, and it was high, terrifyingly high. Just a few feet below the street level, the pipe was almost full. And there, huddled against the curved wall, was Sam. The water was up to his chin. He was holding a sodden, shivering cat above his head, pressing his small body against the concrete as the current tried to peel him away. Next to him was Lou. The Bulldog was almost submerged. Only his broad head remained above the surface, his nose angled sharply upward, snorting for air. He was wedged between Sam and the current, his heavy body acting as a breakwater, taking the full force of the flow to create a pocket of stillness for the boy. "Sam," Mark bellowed, "grab the rope. Grab it." He threw the line. It splashed into the water inches from the boy's chest. Sam stared at the rope. His eyes were wide, vacant, locked in a trance of sensory overload. He didn't reach for it. He couldn't. His hands were frozen around the cat, his knuckles white. To let go of the cat was to violate the one rule his mind was clinging to: save the kitty. "He won't grab it," Miller shouted, shining the light down. "He's freezing up." "Sam, drop the cat. Grab the rope," Mark screamed, desperation clawing at his throat. The water rose another inch. A wave washed over Lou's head. The dog disappeared for a second, then resurfaced, coughing violently, spitting out black water. He was exhausted. Bulldogs are not swimmers. Their dense bodies sink like stones. Lou was treading water on sheer willpower, his back legs thrashing in the dark. Then, Lou did something that stopped Mark's heart. The dog realized the boy wouldn't move. He realized the rope was drifting away in the current. Lou lunged. He didn't lunge for safety. He lunged for the boy. He opened his powerful jaws and clamped down gently but firmly on the thick fabric of Sam's winter coat, right near the shoulder. Then, Lou began to paddle backward. He wasn't swimming toward the wall. He was swimming toward the dangling rope. But the current was too strong. As Lou pulled the boy away from the wall, the full weight of the water hit them both. Lou's head went under. He didn't let go. Mark watched in horror from above as the white shape of the dog sank beneath the murky surface, dragging the boy toward the lifeline. Lou was using his own body as a counterweight, sinking himself to lift the boy. Sam, suddenly pulled by the dog, collided with the rope. Instinct took over. He wrapped one arm around the yellow line, still clutching the cat with the other. "He's got it!" Miller yelled. But Lou was gone. The water swirled over the spot where the dog had been, dark and unbroken. "Pull!" Mark screamed, grabbing the rope. "Pull him up!" They hauled on the line. Sam was light, but the current fought them, dragging at his legs. Inch by inch, the boy rose from the pit, coughing, crying, the cat still clamped to his chest. Miller reached down, grabbed the back of Sam's jacket, and hauled him onto the wet pavement. Sam collapsed, gasping for air. The cat bolted into the night. Mark dropped the rope and threw himself flat on the ground, staring into the hole. The water rushed on, black and empty. "Lou!" Mark screamed. "Lou!" There was nothing. No white head, no snorting breath. Just the relentless, hungry roar of the storm drain swallowing everything in its path. The anchor had held long enough to save the ship, but now the anchor was lost to the deep. The yellow rope lay coiled on the wet asphalt like a dead snake. Mark stared at the frayed end of the line, his chest heaving, his hands still gripping the nylon weave so tightly that his knuckles were white. There was no weight on it. No tension. Just the slack, lifeless loop that had come back up from the dark. A few feet away, Deputy Miller was hunched over Sam. The boy was coughing up river water, his small body shaking violently in the glare of the headlights. He was alive. The rescue was a success. The radio on Miller's shoulder was crackling with the voice of a dispatcher, asking for a status update, a burst of static that sounded like applause from a distant world. But Mark didn't hear it. The world had narrowed down to the black, gaping mouth of the storm drain. "Lou?" Mark whispered. The sound was swallowed instantly by the wind. He crawled forward, ignoring the fire in his shattered leg, dragging himself to the very edge of the abyss. He grabbed Miller's discarded flashlight and swept the beam back and forth across the churning water below. "Lou, here, boy, come on!" The light danced over the surface. It illuminated trash, dead leaves, a floating plastic bottle spinning in an eddy. It showed the violent speed of the current, a relentless, murky conveyor belt moving tons of water into the deep underground tunnels of the city. But it did not show a dog. There was no white head bobbing in the gloom, no desperate paws scratching at the concrete walls, and most terrifying of all, there was no sound. For 12 years, silence had been a stranger in Mark's house. Lou was a creature of noise. He snored when he slept, wheezed when he walked, and grunted when he ate. His breathing was the background track of Mark's life, a constant, rhythmic reminder that he wasn't alone. Now, the only sound coming from the pit was the cold, indifferent roar of the water. He didn't come up," Mark said, his voice trembling. He looked up at Miller, his eyes wide and hollow. "He pushed the boy. I saw him. He pushed him, and he went under." Miller looked up from the boy. The young deputy's face was pale, stripped of all its earlier authority and arrogance. He looked at the empty drain, then at Mark, and finally at the empty space where the dog should have been. The realization hit him, and he looked away, unable to meet Mark's gaze. "The current it's too fast, Mark," Miller said softly. "The drop-off to the main line is just 10 yards down, if he went under." "Don't you say it," Mark snarled. He leaned further into the hole, his face inches from the rushing water. "Lou, fight it. You stubborn old mule, don't you dare quit on me now." He waited. He prayed for a cough, a splash, a whine, anything. Nothing. The water rushed on, dark and secretive. It had taken the offering and moved on, indifferent to the transaction. Mark slumped back onto his heels. The rain hammered against his face, mingling with the hot tears that were finally spilling over. He looked at his hands, the hands that had once saved lives, the hands that had failed his partner 5 years ago. And now, the hands that had failed the only living thing that had stuck by him through the wreckage of his life. Lou hadn't just died. He had spent the last ounce of his strength, the last breath in his scarred lungs, to save a stranger. He had done what Mark had been too afraid to do. He had traded his life for the boys, without hesitation, without asking for glory, without even a bark of complaint. A profound, crushing silence settled over Mark's heart. It was a silence louder than the storm, heavier than the water. It was the silence of an empty house, the silence of a leash hanging on a hook with no one to wear it. Mark looked at the black water again. The fear that had paralyzed him for 5 years, the fear of the water, the fear of failure, the fear of pain, suddenly evaporated. It wasn't replaced by courage. It was replaced by something far more dangerous. It was replaced by the absolute refusal to live in a world where that dog died alone in the dark. Mark stood up. He didn't wobble. He didn't check his bad leg. He wiped the rain from his eyes and looked at Miller. "Watch the kid," Mark said. His voice was dead calm. Miller blinked, confused. "What?" "Mark, wait. The ambulance is 2 minutes out. You need to get checked out. You're in shock." "I said watch the kid," Mark repeated. He turned back to the drain. He didn't look for a rope. He didn't look for a plan. He just looked at the water. "Mark." Miller scrambled up, realizing too late what was happening. "Mark, don't you do it. That's suicide." Mark didn't listen. He took a breath, stepped to the edge of the curb, and let himself fall forward into the darkness. The impact was not a splash. It was a collision. Mark hit the black water, and the breath was instantly hammered from his lungs. The cold was absolute, a freezing, physical weight that wrapped around his chest like iron bands, squeezing the air out and driving panic in. For a terrifying second, he didn't know which way was up. The world was a churning, violent centrifuge of liquid and darkness. The current seized him immediately. It didn't flow, it threw him. Mark was tossed against the concrete wall of the pipe, his shoulder grinding against the slime-coated masonry. The pain in his shattered leg flared white-hot, a screaming nerve that threatened to black him out. But Mark bit down on his tongue until he tasted copper. "Focus," he screamed inwardly. "Do not pass out. Do not let go." He was back in the element that had ruined him. The water. The enemy. For 5 years, he hadn't even stepped in a swimming pool. He had avoided rivers, lakes, even deep bathtubs. He had convinced himself that if he ever went back in, the water would finish what it started that day on the Hocking River. It would drown him, just like it had drowned the best part of his soul. But as Mark tumbled through the subterranean dark, sweeping his arms blindly through the filth, he realized something. The fear was gone. There was no room for it. There was only the image of a white, wrinkled face and a pair of stubborn, soulful eyes looking back at him. "I am not leaving you," Mark thought, kicking his good leg to right himself. "I am not walking away this time." He forced his eyes open. It was useless. The water was a slurry of mud, oil, and debris. He was flying blind in a concrete throat that was rapidly filling to the ceiling. He had seconds, maybe a minute, before the pipe siphoned completely and trapped him without air. He reached out, his fingers clawing through the murk. He felt tree branches, plastic bags, the slick, rot-slicked bottom of the pipe. He kicked harder, propelling himself deeper into the tunnel, following the flow. Bulldogs don't float. They sink. Lou would be on the bottom. Mark dove. He tucked his chin and drove his body down toward the floor of the drain, fighting the buoyancy of his jacket. His hand scraped against something sharp, a rusted piece of rebar jutting from the concrete, tearing his palm open, but he didn't pull back. He swept his arm in a wide arc, searching. Nothing. Just the cold, rushing emptiness. His lungs began to burn. The carbon dioxide buildup was triggering the biological panic alarm, the uncontrollable urge to inhale. His vision sparkled with false lights. He's gone. a voice whispered in his ear. "You're too late. Just like last time. You're just a cripple playing hero." Mark roared a silent scream into the water, purging the last of his air to sink deeper. No. His fingers brushed something. It wasn't concrete. It wasn't wood. It was soft, yielding, but heavy. Mark grabbed it. A sodden mass of trash. He shoved it away, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He reached again, stretching his arm until his shoulder popped. There. His fingertips grazed metal. Cold, hard, studded metal. It was the collar. Mark's hand closed around the thick leather band. He pulled, bracing his boots against the slippery floor of the pipe. The weight on the other end was immense, dead weight, motionless and anchored by the current. It felt like trying to pull a boulder off the riverbed. He didn't have the air. His chest was convulsing. The darkness was closing in, turning from black to gray. He needed to surface. He needed to breathe. But if he let go, the current would take Lou. If he let go, the dog would be swept into the main interceptor line, lost forever in the miles of city sewage. "Don't let go," Mark told himself. "Not this time." He planted his feet. He ignored the screaming of his lungs. He ignored the agony in his bad leg. He grabbed the collar with both hands, twisted his fingers into the leather, and heaved. The mass shifted. Mark kicked off the bottom, driving upward with every ounce of strength left in his deteriorating body. He dragged the dead weight with him, fighting gravity, fighting the water, fighting the inevitable. He broke the surface. Mark gasped, a ragged, desperate sound that echoed off the tunnel walls. The air was foul, thick with the smell of the storm. But it was oxygen. He coughed, spitting out water, and hauled the bundle in his arms up against his chest. He was 20 yards down the tunnel. The light from the street grate was a distant, pale square far behind him. He was alone in the dark, treading water in a flooding sewer, holding the limp, heavy body of his best friend. "I got you," Mark choked out, his voice breaking in the echo chamber. "I got you, buddy." Lou didn't move. His head lolled back against Mark's shoulder, water streaming from his nose and mouth. He was heavy, cold, and terrifyingly still. Mark pressed his ear to the dog's wet chest, trying to hear a heartbeat over the roar of the water. But there was nothing. Just the silence of the end. But Mark refused to accept the silence. He tightened his grip on the collar, turned against the current, and began the impossible swim back toward the light. The journey back against the current was a blur of violence and will. Mark didn't swim so much as he clawed his way upstream, one hand gripping the rusted ladder rungs embedded in the wall, the other clamped inextricably onto the leather of Lou's collar. Above him, the square of gray light grew closer. Hands reached down, Miller's hands joined by others now. Gloved hands, firefighter hands. "I've got him!" Miller screamed, his voice cracking with strain. "Grab the harness." Mark shoved Lou upward with the last reserves of his strength. The weight was lifted from his arms as 3 men hauled the limp, sodden mass of the Bulldog over the lip of the grate and onto the street. Mark followed, dragged up by his jacket, his bad leg scraping agonizingly against the iron rim. He collapsed onto the wet asphalt, gasping, the rain hammering against his face. But he didn't stay down. He scrambled onto his hands and knees, crawling toward the unmoving shape of his dog. The scene was chaotic. Red and blue lights strobed against the curtain of rain. An ambulance idled nearby, its back doors open. A paramedic, a heavy-set man with a weary face, was already kneeling beside Mark, trying to drape a blanket over his shoulders. "Sir, you need to lie down," the paramedic urged, reaching for Mark's wrist. "You're in shock. Your leg looks—" Mark shoved the man away. The force of it knocked the medic back on his heels. "Not me," Mark roared, his voice raw and terrifying. "The dog! Help the dog!" The paramedic glanced at Lou. The bulldog lay on his side, his tongue lolling out onto the pavement, blue-gray and slack. His barrel chest was still. His eyes were half open, glazed over with the dull sheen of death. "Sir?" the medic said, his voice dropping to a sympathetic but firm register. "He's gone. We need to focus on you. You've swallowed sewage water. You could have secondary drowning." "He is not gone," Mark snarled. He ignored the pain screaming in his shattered tibia. He ignored the blood dripping from his torn palm. He dragged himself over to Lou and positioned himself above the dog's rib cage. Mark had been a swiftwater rescue technician for 10 years. He knew the rhythm of life. He knew the mechanics of forcing a heart to beat when it had decided to stop. He placed the heel of his hand over the widest part of Lou's chest, interlaced his fingers, and locked his elbows. "Come on," Mark whispered, the rain dripping from his nose onto Lou's wet fur. He began compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. He pushed hard. Too hard, maybe. He could feel the ribs flexing under his weight, a sickening, yielding sensation that made him nauseous. But he didn't stop. He established a rhythm, a frantic, driving cadence that matched the beat of the Bee Gees song they taught in training. Only in his head, it wasn't a disco tune. It was a war drum. "Breathe, damn you," Mark grunted, pumping the chest. "Breathe." He stopped, leaned down, and clamped his mouth over the dog's wet, cold nose. He sealed his lips and blew, forcing air into the silent lungs. He tasted mud. He tasted the foul copper tang of the sewer. He tasted death. He pulled back and watched the chest. Nothing. "Sir, please," the paramedic said softly, stepping closer again. "It's been too long. His heart has stopped." "I don't care." Mark didn't look up. He went back to compressions. 1, 2, 3, 4. The world around them faded. The deputy, the firefighters, the weeping mother holding Sam in the back of the ambulance. They all became ghosts. There was only the man and the dog in a circle of streetlights and rain. Mark was weeping now, ugly, jagged sobs that tore from his throat with every downward thrust of his hands. "You don't get to quit. You hear me? I quit. I gave up. You don't get to be like me. You're the good one, Lou. You're the good one." His arms burned, his vision blurred. He had been pumping for 2 minutes. In the medical world, 2 minutes without a pulse was an eternity. It was a sentence. He leaned down for another breath. He blew into the snout, desperate, pleading, pouring his own life force into the animal. He pulled back. Stillness. The dog was just a wet pile of fur. The gravity of the situation settled on Mark's shoulders, heavier than the water, heavier than the iron grate. It was over. The anchor was gone, and Mark was adrift. He slumped back, sitting on his heels, his hands trembling in his lap. He looked at Lou's face, that ugly, beautiful, wrinkled face that had rested on his foot every night for a decade. "I'm sorry," Mark whispered, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry, buddy." He reached out a shaking hand to close Lou's eyes. Then, a twitch. It was so subtle Mark thought it was a raindrop hitting the dog's flank. But then it happened again. A spasm in the flank, a ripple of muscle under the wet skin. Suddenly, Lou's entire body convulsed. It wasn't a gentle awakening. It was a violent, full-body heave. The dog's mouth slammed shut, then flew open. A sound erupted from him, a wet, explosive expulsion of air and fluid. Lou sneezed. A torrent of black water and mud sprayed from his nose and mouth, splattering across the pavement. He gasped, a ragged, terrible, wheezing intake of air that sounded like a vacuum seal breaking. Mark froze, his hands hovering in the air, his mouth open in disbelief. Lou coughed again, his whole body shaking, retching up the river he had swallowed. His chest heaved, his back legs kicked out, scraping against the asphalt. And then, slowly, agonizingly, he lifted his heavy head. He blinked. The glaze was gone. The dark, soulful eyes focused, drifting lazily until they found Mark. Lou let out a low, miserable groan, the exact same groan he made when Mark was late with dinner. Mark didn't cheer, he didn't shout. He simply collapsed forward, wrapping his arms around the wet, stinking, heaving neck of the dog, and buried his face in the fur. He sobbed, not from grief, but from a relief so profound it felt like physical pain. "He's back," Miller whispered in the background, his voice filled with awe. "I can't believe it. He's actually back." The paramedic stared, then shook his head, a small, weary smile touching his lips. He reached down and finally draped the thermal blanket over Mark's shaking shoulders, this time covering the dog as well. "Okay," the medic said gently. "Okay. Let's get you both out of the rain." 2 weeks after the floodwaters receded, the sky over Blackwood turned an aggressive, brilliant blue, the kind that hurts the eyes if you stare at it too long. The relentless gray curtain was gone, replaced by a sun that baked the remaining mud into dry, cracking dust. Mark sat on the bottom step of his front porch, a mug of black coffee steaming in his hands. The beer cans were gone. The yard was still a mess of debris, driftwood, plastic wrappers, and silt. But for the first time in 5 years, Mark didn't look at the mess and see a reflection of himself. He just saw a yard that needed raking. 10 feet away, in a patch of sunlight that stretched across the peeling floorboards, lay Lou. The Bulldog was asleep, but it was a fitful rest. The ordeal in the storm drain had left him with a permanent, rattling cough, a chronic bronchitis that made his breathing sound like a coffee percolator struggling to brew. He had lost weight, his skin hanging a little looser on his frame, and he moved with a stiffness that mirrored Mark's own shattered gait. But he was there, solid, warm, breathing. Sitting beside the dog was Sam. The boy wore a clean t-shirt and shorts, the red sneakers replaced by sandals. He held a soft, bristled brush in his hand, moving it rhythmically down Lou's back. Stroke, pause, stroke, pause. Sam didn't look at Mark. He didn't speak. He just focused entirely on the task of grooming the dog who had become his shadow. Since the accident, Sam came over every day after school. He didn't ask permission. He just walked into the yard, sat next to Lou, and started brushing. Lou, for his part, accepted the adoration with the stoic entitlement of a king. Around his thick neck, nearly hidden by the rolls of fur, hung a small, cheap ribbon with a gold-plated medallion. The mayor had presented it 3 days ago in a ceremony that made Lou sneeze on the town councilman's shoes. The hero of Blackwood, they called him. Mark took a sip of coffee, watching the dust motes dance in the light. He reached down and rubbed his left shin. The pain was still there. It always would be. But the fear that used to ride shotgun with it had vanished. The water hadn't killed him. The failure hadn't destroyed him. He had gone back into the dark and came back out with something precious. "He likes it behind the ears," Mark said softly, breaking the silence. Sam paused, the brush hovering in midair. He looked at Lou's ears, then slowly adjusted his angle. He brushed the soft velvet spot behind the dog's ear. Lou's back leg kicked out in a reflexive, thumping rhythm of pure ecstasy. Sam smiled. It was a small, fragile thing. but it was there. Mark set his coffee down and stood up. He winced as his leg took his weight, but he didn't grab the railing. He walked to the front door, catching his reflection in the glass of the storm window. The man looking back was different. The 3-day beard stubble was gone, shaved clean this morning. The eyes, usually bloodshot and hollow, looked tired but clear. He looked like a man who had survived a shipwreck and washed up on a shore he intended to build a house on. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. For years, this device had been a source of dread. It was a portal to a world he felt unworthy of. He scrolled through the contacts until he found the name he had ignored for 5 years. The name that represented the life he thought he had forfeited. Ellen. His thumb hovered over the call button. His heart gave a familiar flutter of anxiety, but then he heard it, the wet, rattling snore from the porch behind him. He turned and looked at Lou. The dog was flat on his side, exposing his belly to the sun, completely vulnerable, completely at peace. Lou had jumped into the dark without a plan. He had anchored himself against a flood to save a stranger. He had proven that being broken didn't mean being useless. If a stubborn, arthritic dog can do it, Mark whispered to himself, then I have no damn excuse. He pressed the button and lifted the phone to his ear. The ringing tone purred in the speaker. Once. Twice. Then a voice, hesitant, breathless, as if she couldn't quite believe the caller ID. Mark? Mark leaned against the doorframe, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face and the steady, rhythmic breathing of his dog behind him. He closed his eyes, not to hide, but to savor the moment. Hi, Elle, he said, his voice raspy but steady. I think I'm ready to come up for air. On the porch, Lou let out a long, contented sigh, shifted his weight, and went back to sleep, the heavy iron anchor that had held Mark through the storm finally resting in the calm waters of home. You know, there's an old saying among folks who love dogs. Who rescued who? Mark thought he was saving Lou from the storm drain. But we all know the truth. Lou had been saving Mark every single day for 5 years. If this story touched your heart, I have a small favor to ask. I want to know I'm not alone in feeling this. If you believe that animals are sometimes the best healers we have, just leave a simple, I believe, in the comments below. Or, if you have a Lou of your own, a pet who anchored you when life got heavy, tell me their name. I read every single one, and I'd love to honor them with you. And if you want to join me for more stories like this, stories about second chances, quiet miracles, and the bonds that never break, please click that subscribe button. It's not just a click, it's an invitation to our next journey together. Until next time, hold your loved ones close and never underestimate the heart of an old dog. Take care.